For centuries, scholars, theologians, and archaeologists have debated the historical reality of the biblical Exodus, the dramatic account of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt under the oppressive rule of a stubborn and unrelenting Pharaoh. While many have dismissed it as myth or allegory, a growing body of evidence suggests that the Exodus may not only be historical, but that we may even know the identity of the Pharaoh who witnessed the plagues firsthand. In this video, we'll examine the extraordinary findings in Tomb KV-35, the burial site of Pharaoh Amenhotep II, and how its contents align closely with the biblical account of the Exodus. We will explore the discovery of his remarkably preserved mummy, the mysterious boil-like lesions covering his body, the unprecedented presence of his firstborn son's remains in the same tomb, and how all of this fits into the broader historical and chronological context of the 18th dynasty of Egypt. If you're fascinated by the prehistoric civilizations missing from our history books, embark on a remarkable journey with our ebook, Prehistoric Megastructures. This nearly 500-page volume is packed with images and in-depth explorations of some of the most astonishing and unexplained ancient structures ever discovered, monuments that were clearly built with advanced technology from a time long forgotten. There's a limited discount on the ebook, so make sure to click the link in the description or top-pinned comment and uncover the mysteries that mainstream history refuses to acknowledge. In 1898, French Egyptologist Victor Loret was excavating in the Valley of the Kings, one of Egypt's most archaeologically rich sites. He discovered a tomb cut into the rock face at the base of a cliff and identified it by an inscribed funerary statuette as the burial place of Amenhotep II, a pharaoh of Egypt's 18th dynasty. The tomb, designated KV-35, would prove to be one of the most remarkable and unusual discoveries in Egyptology. When Loret and his team entered the tomb, they found signs of ancient looting. Broken artifacts and damaged furniture were strewn across the floor. But deeper in the tomb, down a long descending tunnel and past a shaft designed to deter robbers, they entered a chamber that still held the sarcophagus of Amenhotep II. Remarkably, the coffin was not empty. Inside, they found a mummified body wrapped in a linen shroud bearing the pharaoh's name. This identification was further confirmed through forensic and inscriptional analysis. Unlike most royal mummies, which had been moved in antiquity for safekeeping, Amenhotep II's body had remained in his own tomb, an archaeological rarity. One of the most striking and puzzling discoveries came later, when the mummy of Amenhotep II was studied in detail by renowned anatomist G. Elliott Smith. In his examination, published in the Catalogue of the Royal Mummies, Smith observed that the pharaoh's body was covered with unusual lesions, boil-like protrusions he described as tubercles. These lesions, covering most of the body, were unlike anything seen on any other mummy from the Valley of the Kings. This discovery takes on dramatic significance in light of Exodus 9:10, which describes one of the plagues sent by God through Moses. And they took ashes of the furnace and stood before Pharaoh, and Moses sprinkled it up toward heaven, and it became a boil breaking forth with blains upon man and upon beast. Could these tubercles be physical evidence of that very plague? While we cannot know for certain the medical cause of these sores, the fact that only one royal mummy is afflicted this way, and that it happens to belong to a pharaoh who fits the Exodus timeline, is deeply compelling. Another key detail from the biblical account is the 10th and final plague, the death of the firstborn. According to Exodus 12:29, at midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon. If the Pharaoh of the Exodus truly lost his firstborn son to this plague, one would expect that child to have died before the Pharaoh, and thus to have been buried in the Pharaoh's tomb, which would have been sealed upon the king's death. In KV 35, Lauret found funerary statuettes bearing not only the name of Amenhotep II, but also that of a young prince named Webensenu, described in inscriptions as king's son of his body. This designation confirms that he was the biological son of the pharaoh. Lauret also discovered a mummified boy, aged between 11 and 15 years, buried in the tomb. The mummy bore the distinctive royal side lock, a lock of hair on one side of the otherwise shaved head, indicating royal blood and status as a crown prince. This hairstyle is well attested in Egyptian iconography and was worn by sons of the king. In addition to the body, a canopic jar, used in mummification to store internal organs, was found inscribed with Webensenu's name, further confirming his identity and burial in the same tomb as his father. This detail is of tremendous importance. In ancient Egyptian burial customs, tombs were sealed permanently upon the death of the pharaoh. The only way for Webensenu to be buried in KV 35 is if he died before Amenhotep II. If Webensenu was the firstborn son of the pharaoh, as the evidence suggests, then his premature death before his father powerfully supports the biblical narrative of the plague of the firstborn. A common objection raised against identifying the Pharaoh of the Exodus is the assumption that he must have drowned in the Red Sea during the pursuit of the Israelites, meaning his body would have been lost, not mummified in a tomb. However, a closer reading of the biblical text reveals that this is not necessarily the case. Exodus 14:28 states, "The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived." Crucially, it does not say that Pharaoh himself entered the sea. It is common throughout history for monarchs and generals to send their armies into battle while remaining at a safer distance. Pharaohs were divine figures. Their deaths in battle would have been catastrophic for the state and religion. It is entirely plausible that Amenhotep II dispatched his forces while remaining behind, allowing his survival and the preservation of his body. Even Psalm 136:15 uses the phrasing, "He overthrew Pharaoh and his host in the Red Sea," which may refer to a military defeat or humiliation rather than literal death. Furthermore, Exodus 14:30 says that the Israelites saw the Egyptians lying dead on the seashore, suggesting that bodies were recovered. This means that even if Pharaoh did in fact drown with the rest of his army, given the importance of preserving the pharaoh's body for religious reasons, if his body were lost and later found, it would have been mummified, explaining why Amenhotep II's remains are still intact. One of the strongest cases for Amenhotep II as the pharaoh of the Exodus is the chronological match between his reign and the biblical date for the Exodus event. According to 1 Kings 6:1, the Exodus occurred 480 years before Solomon began building the temple, which most scholars date to 966 BC. This gives us a calculated Exodus date of 1446 BC. Amenhotep II reigned from 1450 to 1410 BC according to High Egyptian chronology, placing him in power at exactly the right time to be the pharaoh who confronted Moses and endured the 10 plagues. In addition, his father, Thutmose III, reigned for 54 years, the longest reign of any pharaoh in the 18th dynasty. This is significant because Exodus 2 describes Moses fleeing Egypt after Pharaoh tried to kill him, and then living in Midian for 40 years until the king of Egypt died. The only pharaoh in the 18th dynasty who ruled long enough to accommodate Moses' 40-year exile is Thutmose III. Thus, Thutmose III would be the pharaoh of Moses' youth, and Amenhotep II the Exodus pharaoh himself. Another intriguing detail is the restricted access to KV 35 in modern times. Despite its extraordinary significance and preservation, the tomb has often been closed to the public, raising questions among researchers and independent explorers. In a recent visit to Egypt, author and filmmaker Tim Mahoney, accompanied by his son, had to negotiate with local officials to gain entry to the tomb and film the interior. Why is such a historically rich and biblically significant tomb not a central attraction like Tutankhamun's? Some believe the answer lies in the controversial implications of the evidence. If Amenhotep II truly was the pharaoh of the Exodus, and his tomb contains physical evidence aligning with biblical accounts, then it lends historical credibility to the Bible, something that unsettles certain academic circles. If Amenhotep II is indeed the pharaoh of the Exodus, then the Exodus narrative is grounded in real historical events. The Israelites were not mythical. They were an enslaved people who walked free under divine deliverance. Pharaoh was not a fable. He was a real ruler who hardened his heart, lost his son, and was struck with divine plagues. The evidence found in KV 35 does not prove the entire Exodus account beyond doubt, but it adds weight and historical credibility to a story often dismissed as religious myth. It shows that archaeology, when honestly examined, can echo the ancient voices of Scripture. Despite the mounting evidence, many modern scholars resist the identification of Amenhotep II as the Exodus pharaoh. Reasons range from skepticism toward the Bible to disagreements over Egyptian chronology. Others reinterpret biblical numbers, for example, saying the 480 years of 1 Kings are symbolic, to fit alternative models. Yet, when taken at face value, the biblical record and the archaeological record fit remarkably well when viewed through the lens of Amenhotep II. However, the tomb of the Exodus pharaoh is not the only evidence supporting the biblical narrative. For many years, secular scholars looked upon the story of the 10 plagues of Moses as one that did not actually happen, but rather one written by the Israelites at a later date to show the power of their God over the gods of others. However, recent evidence has emerged that suggests the 10 biblical plagues of Moses and Pharaoh could actually have taken place. In 2010, researchers studying stalagmites in Egyptian caves and using the geological evidence they obtained to rebuild and map weather patterns deep into the past noticed something dramatic had taken place 3,000 years ago, at about the same time as the Exodus story is believed to have happened. The evidence showed that during that time, a dramatic climate shift had suddenly taken place, resulting in rapidly rising temperatures and severe drought across Egypt, so severe, in fact, that it would have dried up the mighty Nile River and turned it into what researchers described as a slow-moving and muddy watercourse. With these groundbreaking findings in hand, researchers from around the world quickly began putting together how this could have directly led to the 10 plagues spoken about in the Bible. Following the order of the plagues given in Exodus, we begin with the first plague. He raised his staff in the presence of Pharaoh and his officials and struck the water of the Nile, and all the water was changed into blood. The fish in the Nile died, and the river smelled so bad that the Egyptians could not drink its water. As temperatures rose and the Nile dried up into a slow-moving and muddy watercourse, Numerous researchers have pointed out that this would have provided the perfect conditions for the bloom of toxic freshwater algae called Oscillatoria rubescens, also known as burgundy blood algae. As the name suggests, burgundy blood algae gives water a blood-red appearance, often called red tide. More importantly, it makes the water toxic, leading to the death of aquatic life and giving the water an unpleasant smell, making it the perfect explanation for the biblical account of the Nile turning to blood. The second plague. I will plague your whole country with frogs. The Nile will teem with frogs. They will come up into your palace and your bedroom and onto your bed, into the houses of your officials and on your people, and into your ovens and kneading troughs. Toxic algae in the Nile River would have meant that frogs were forced to leave their natural habitat in the water and move onto dry land, covering the country with what must have seemed like a plague of frogs. The third plague. When Aaron stretched out his hand with the rod and struck the dust of the ground, lice came upon men and animals. All the dust throughout the land of Egypt became lice. As frogs lost their aquatic habitat and moved onto land, they would have died in large numbers. With the loss of much of the frog population, insects like lice would have lost their natural predators and proliferated, surely making it feel like all the dust throughout the land became lice. The fourth plague. Dense swarms of flies poured into Pharaoh's palace and into the houses of his officials. Throughout Egypt, the land was ruined by the flies. Similarly, a dense swarms of flies would again make sense in the context of a widespread frog genocide. The fifth plague. The hand of the Lord will bring a terrible plague on your livestock in the field, on your horses, donkeys, and camels, and on your cattle, sheep, and goats. And the next day, the Lord did it. All the livestock of the Egyptians died. Insects like lice and flies carry diseases for both humans and animals. Scientists believe that the fifth plague could have been caused by insects spreading either African horse sickness or blue tongue in livestock, leading to widespread deaths in the animal population. The sixth plague. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Take handfuls of soot from a furnace and have Moses toss it into the air in the presence of Pharaoh. It will become fine dust over the whole land of Egypt, and festering boils will break out on people and animals throughout the land." Similarly, the proliferation of insects could result in an outbreak of boils among humans, either due to fly bites, which can cause boils, by the spread of disease through these bites, or through the consumption of tainted meat from diseased animals. The seventh plague. So the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. Hail fell and lightning flashed back and forth. It was the worst storm in all the land of Egypt since it had become a nation. Throughout Egypt, hail struck everything in the fields, both people and animals. It beat down everything growing in the fields and stripped every tree. Return to the idea that a dramatic climate shift took place at this time, and it would be easy to explain the worst hailstorm of all time as simply a historic climate event. However, some scientists have a different explanation. Almost 3,500 years ago, one of the largest volcanic eruptions in history took place on the island of Santorini in the Mediterranean, spewing billions of tons of volcanic ash into the atmosphere. Initially, researchers did not connect this eruption to Egypt, which is hundreds of miles away, until they started finding pumice stones made from cooled volcanic ash at sites around the country. Analysis of these stones showed that they did indeed come from the Santorini eruption in the Mediterranean. Perhaps these pumice stones, falling from a thick cloud of volcanic ash, explain the seventh biblical plague, the largest volcanic eruption in history, leading to the worst hailstorm ever. The eighth plague. The Lord made an east wind blow across the land all that day and all that night. By morning, the wind had brought the locusts. They invaded all Egypt and settled down in every area of the country in great numbers. They covered all the ground until it was black. They devoured all that was left after the hail, everything growing in the fields and the fruit on the trees. Nothing green remained on tree or plant in all the land of Egypt. As with lice and other insects, locusts could have emerged in large numbers after the large-scale death of the frog population. However, it has also been pointed out that volcanic eruptions can cause favorable conditions for locusts. In the words of one scientist, the ash fallout caused weather anomalies, which translates into higher precipitation, higher humidity, and that's exactly what fosters the presence of the locusts. In either case, the widespread prevalence of locusts is easily explained. The ninth plague. Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky, and total darkness covered all Egypt for 3 days. No one could see anyone else or move about for 3 days. Similarly, billions of tons of volcanic ash spewed into the atmosphere would surely have the power to block out the sun for a few days at a time. At the same time, the extreme drought that was experienced could have led to sandstorms with never-before-seen intensity. Like locusts, 3 days of darkness can be explained by both volcanic eruption and climate shift. The 10th plague. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne, to the firstborn son of the female slave, who is at her handmill. An explanation for the final plague can be found by returning to the first plague, which was the toxic algae bloom in the Nile River. Toxic algae release mycotoxins, a poisonous substance that can contaminate grain. Since firstborn sons would have been both the first sent to work in the fields harvesting grain, and as future patriarchs, those eating first and eating the most at meals, contaminated grain could have caused disproportionate deaths among them. Put each of these 10 plagues together, and the implication is clear. A dramatic climate shift in Egypt at the time of Exodus, alongside a historic volcanic eruption in the Mediterranean at around the same time, means that the plagues described in the Bible were likely real events. The story of the Israelites and their escape from captivity in Egypt continues in Exodus chapter 14, after the 10th plague finally convinces the Pharaoh to let them leave. Shortly after they do, Pharaoh changes his mind, summoning his 600 best chariots and marching his army in pursuit. In short order, Pharaoh's army corners the Israelites at Pi-Hahiroth, trapping them between mountains on one side and the Red Sea on the other. In this dire situation, God speaks to Moses, telling him, "Lift up your rod and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, and the children of Israel shall go on dry ground through the midst of the sea." After he does, a strong east wind blows all night, parting the waters. So the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on the dry ground, and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Realizing that the Israelites were escaping, the Egyptian army set off in pursuit. But when the Israelites reach the other side, God commands Moses to reach out his hand again. Then the waters returned and covered the chariots, the horsemen, and all the army of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. Not so much as one of them remained. While the story of the parting of the Red Sea is certainly one of the Bible's most dramatic tales, it was long considered one of its most impossible. That is, until 2010, when a scientist from the National Center for Atmospheric Research at the University of Colorado named Carl Drews began using computer modeling to explore the potential for a phenomenon called wind set-down to have taken place in ancient Egypt. Wind set-down is a phenomenon in which strong winds blow the water in a lake or sea to one side, effectively parting the waters and leaving dry land in its place for a short time. As Drews described, the parting of the waters can be understood through fluid dynamics. The wind moves the water in a way that's in accordance with physical laws, creating a safe passage with water on two sides and then abruptly allowing the water to rush back in. Drews believed that wind set down could have taken place in ancient Egypt, creating a pathway of dry land which the Israelites could have crossed during their exodus, before the water suddenly rushed back in and closed their path. In order to explore his theory, Drews studied ancient geography to construct likely locations, then used computer simulations to recreate the conditions that may have resulted in wind set down. Nearly the first thing he did was rule out the Red Sea as a potential location, both because it runs from north to south, which doesn't fit with the biblical description of wind from the east sweeping water to one side, and because at 190 miles wide and an average of 1,640 feet deep, that's a lot of water to move and a long way for the Israelites to go if it had. However, Drews' computer simulation did find a location in the area where wind set down could have taken place at around 1250 BCE, when the story of Exodus was said to have happened, a body of water known in modern times as Lake Tanis. There, Drews found that steady 63 miles per hour winds from the east would have pushed the waters of Lake Tanis back to its western shores and created a land bridge which would remain dry for hours. Amazing as the finding was, one might wonder what it had to do with the biblical story of Exodus, in which Moses and the Israelites were said to have crossed the Red Sea, not Lake Tanis. Well, according to scholars, it was not actually the Red Sea which Moses and the Israelites crossed. In the original Hebrew text, the body of water that is crossed is not called the Red Sea, but the Sea of Reeds. A mistranslation happened when the text was first translated into Greek in the 3rd century BCE, with the Sea of Reeds becoming the Red Sea in Greek in all future translations. For Drews, this was the key that brought together all the pieces of the puzzle. In 1250 BCE, Lake Tanis was, according to Drews, a shallow, brackish lagoon, which provided the perfect habitat for the growth of papyrus reeds. Once again, it seemed that an astonishing biblical event could be explained by a natural phenomenon. Perhaps wind set down did truly, randomly, take place as the Israelites were fleeing Egypt, allowing them to cross the Sea of Reeds to safety. But either way, there is no doubt it could have happened. In KV 35 lies a king whose life and death may be more famous than any other, not because of his achievements, but because of his resistance to the divine. If Amenhotep II is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, then his story is one of power confronted by divine justice, of pride shattered by plagues, and of a nation transformed forever. Whether viewed through the lens of faith or history, the tomb of Amenhotep II offers something rare, a convergence of scripture and science, of ancient stone and sacred story.